what do you think about this Ukrainian counteroffensive? Is it going to get anything for Ukraine?
Well, as far as I can tell, the answer is no. It seems to me that Ukraine has been pushed into doing this by its Western benefactors, mostly the United States, but some others as well. Even though those benefactors know very well that Ukraine was not properly equipped and the troops not properly trained to launch this counteroffensive. In fact, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal saying just that. And so we've seen the counteroffensive has been going on about a month or so, and with very little progress for Ukraine, but a lot of destruction and a lot of deaths. So it seems to be counterproductive. And I think that this will only quicken Ukraine's demise, as far as I can tell.
You know, yesterday General Petraeus had an interview with CNN. He said that Ukrainians know that they need to do something. If you look at the report of Shoigu, he said that in July Ukrainian lost something like 20,000 soldiers just in July. And how tragic is that? Why they're forcing Ukrainian to carry out a counteroffensive that they're not capable of?
Yeah, because this has nothing to do with Ukraine as far as the West is concerned. This is the goal of this war for the West is to weaken Russia and undermine Russia. And so they are very happy for the Ukrainians to keep fighting, even though it means the destruction of Ukraine, as long as the war continues. That's the only goal here, is to keep the war going, and hope, at least the West hopes, that this will, deal a blow to Russia. They're willing to essentially fight to the last Ukrainian. And the figure you give is staggering, 20,000 in a month. We have to remember during the Vietnam War, the U.S. which was a devastating war for the U.S., obviously much more for Vietnam, we have to say, but it's also devastating for U.S. soldiers. And at that time, the U.S. was losing about 5,000 a month. So this is 4 times that much. And of course, for a country that is much smaller than the United States. So that's a colossal amount of people.
Why the Biden administration is so insisting on continuing this war instead of making a negotiating table and try to negotiate with Russians?
Well, I think there's a few reasons for this. I think, again, one, the U.S. has had this goal of using the war to try to destroy Russia, and they want to keep the war going in the hopes it will do that, or at least undermine Russia. So that's one. Number two, Biden has a political problem. He's running for president in November of 2024, which will come upon us rather quickly. I think he's afraid now that if it appears that Russia has won the conflict, that will hurt his chances for re-election. So I think he wants to at least keep the war going through the election next year, which is amazing. I mean, that's another year and whatever that is, almost 6 months, year and a half, to keep this war going. But I think that's one of his goals. He doesn't want to have certainly a negotiated peace in which Ukraine would lose land and whatnot. And I think that's probably the result at this point, if there were that. And then I guess the third reason that people believe Biden is doing it is because he wants to cover the corruption of himself and his son in Ukraine. I think a lot, there's an aspect to this in which this is a personal war for Biden. because he used his office as vice president, it appears, to get his son a job there, so his job could be, or his son could be enriched. And he doesn't want more evidence of that coming forward. So I think the war is partly about that too. None of these are good reasons for the war, for continuing it, but I do think those are the reasons.
Just the first reason you gave, it was the just bleeding Russia, just trapping Russia in Ukraine. It doesn't seem to work because if you look at Russia today, economy is stronger. We had a peacetime army. Now we have a wartime army. Russia is much stronger. The military industrial complex is functioning in Russia. It's so good that NATO cannot sustain it. You know, when they're not getting those results that they wanted, what 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 do you think about the mindset of this administration? I don't think that the last reason you gave us, you said that Biden is it has something personal in Ukraine, because I don't see Biden has any power in his office. I would argue when he was a vice president in the Obama administration, he was more powerful than now. I don't know who are these whisperers of Biden who are ruling in Washington.
Yeah, well, we do know who those people are. I think Jake Sullivan, Blinken, and Victoria Nuland are some of those people who have probably a Rasputin-like influence over Biden. But when you ask the question, well, what kind of mindset would continue this policy even though it's failing? Well, we have a word for that. Einstein talked about that, right? He said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result, right? That's insanity. Well, this policy is insane. And if you look at most of the wars that the U.S. has been involved in, they've been insane. They have not accomplished the goals, at least the stated goals of those wars. And yet the U.S. keeps going to war.
You know what's so amazing when you see this guy, General Petraeus, comes to CNN and says the same things that he was talking in about Iraq, Afghanistan. This guy lost in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now he's repeating everything again and again, and people are watching him.
Yeah, no, isn't that amazing? Yeah, no, it's exactly right. I mean, this makes no sense. I think it's fair to say that, aside from maybe Grenada in 1983, the U.S. hasn't won a war it's fought since World War II, and only then did it win because of the help of the Soviet Union. So, and yet, as we say, the U.S. continues to start conflicts. So this is madness. Though, of course, it does benefit some people. It does benefit the arms dealers who make a lot of money on this, regardless of who wins, right? Like the 20-year war in Afghanistan, a lot of people made billions, trillions of dollars on that. Didn't matter. The U.S. didn't win. The fact that it went for 20 years was good for business, In fact, I've said there used to be a maxim that the business of the United States is business. But I think the business of the United States now is war. And that's a shame.
You know that there was an article, if I remember it correctly, it was 2021. It says that 20 members of Congress hold stocks in these weapon companies, in the top weapon companies, and these are the guys who are deciding about the foreign policy of the United States.
Yeah,
the money goes on one hand and comes to the other hand, and you know how when we're talking about the functioning democracies, as Biden administration put it in the U.S. security strategy that we are democracies, we are going to send our democracy even with wars. We are selling our democracy. This division between democracies and autocracies, how we can put all these piece of puzzles together. We have member of Congress who are part of this military industrial complex who get elected. How do you see this?
Yeah, well, it's total corruption. You have Lloyd Austin, who's Secretary of Defense. He used to work at Raytheon. There's a total revolving door between private industry and government, which should not be allowed. Obviously, this is a corruption that should be illegal, but it's not. Yeah, I mean, and it's funny, again, the U.S. and the U.S. press, they always talk about corruption in other countries. They always talk about Russian oligarchs. But we have our own oligarchs, and we have our own corruption. There was this incredible report that the Pentagon has been unable to account for the spending of like $21 trillion, right? I mean, you honestly can't think of a more corrupt country in the world, at least in terms of a dollar amount, right? But that's where we're at. And I think the American people aren't happy with it, but they don't know how to stop it. We don't have a truly functioning democracy, is the truth of it. Our choices are limited, and so the corruption goes on.
Getting back to Ukraine, when this war started, Ukraine was they were Russians were willing to negotiate in December 2021, even at those turning points when they went into Ukraine in March 2022, after getting inside Ukraine, they tried to negotiate with the Zelensky administration, but nothing worked. It seems that, in your opinion, why Biden administration decided to go to war with Russia instead of negotiating? Did they think just for a minute that Ukraine can trap Russia?
I think they thought that, or I think more to the point, I think they believed that the sanctions that they leveled against Russia, in which the pretext of that was the war, would destroy Russia's economy. And these are extraordinary sanctions. But then, to their surprise, the sanctions did not destroy the Russian economy, right? I think militarily, they would never have been rational if they thought Ukraine could defeat Russia. But again, I think they thought that Ukraine, with the combination of these economic sanctions, that would, if not be fatal to Russia, it would really sideline Russia. But again, that has not been the case. And so the war goes on. And now, have people in Washington woken up to this reality? Possibly. But now they don't really know how to finish what they've started.
It's so tragic when you see these like 15 months of war in Ukraine. We have this eastern part of Ukraine that is now Russia. It's responsible for something like 85%, 80% of their GDP. And on the western part, they have no significant industrial complex. And just today, I talked with a Russian that he said with Georgian, he said that in the western part, the farm fields are so good and agriculture is so good in the western part. And we know that the western part, these farmlands are they're selling to some foreign companies like BlackRock and so forth and so on. If you see Ukraine before this war and right now, just the situation right now, still Odessa and Nikolaev are part of Ukraine. We don't know if they're gonna be part of Russia or not. If Odessa become part of Russia, that's huge. That and simply Ukraine cannot function after when let someday this war gonna end. And how Ukraine gonna survive with all these problems?
I don't think Ukraine will survive as a nation, not as it's been, not as we know it. I think that's the truth of it. I don't think they'll get back the Donbass or Crimea. Certainly, as you say, the Donbass in particular has most of their industrial output. So yeah, it will not be the same country. It will be a potentially landlocked country that's very weak and very poor, sadly. I think that is the future of Ukraine.
I don't know if you saw there is this website by Ukrainian government. It's called privatization.gov.ua. In this, they put the Ukraine assets to they want to sell Ukraine just something like 400 billion dollars, something like that. It's twice their GDP. Just to imagine how big is this. They want to privatize these assets. If with all this, we know that all this money that goes to Ukraine, someday they have to pay it back. They, how do you see this? Is there any possibility for the Zelensky administration to think about all these problems that he's facing? Beside economical problems, we have human crisis inside Ukraine. We are those women that left Ukraine that they're not getting back. They're trying to get. They're trying to persuade them to get back, but they're not getting back. We have this huge migration from Ukraine. These men that they're sending these men to without any training, just to getting slaughtered on the battlefield. With all that said, what would be the solution for the after Zelensky? Let's say somebody else gets the government, gets elected in Ukraine. What are those difficulties that he's going to face?
Well, all the difficulties you've mentioned, he's going to face a bankrupt country, an indebted country with no industrial base, so therefore very little potential for economic growth. It's going to be it's going to look like what we used to call a third world country. It's going to be an underdeveloped country that's going to probably have to depend on foreign aid just to pay the bills. And that probably is the future, unless, what happens. Another option that could happen is that Russia will take part of Ukraine, Poland and Hungary will take other parts of it, and it'll basically go out of existence. That's the other option as well. So, but any of those options does not paint a very, bright future for Ukraine, certainly.
How do you see this support of the West for the Ukrainian government, whatever government is there in Ukraine? Do you think that it's gonna last forever?
No, of course not. It never does. I mean, look at how many allies the U.S. has abandoned over the years. The U.S. is quite willing to go destroy a country and just walk away from it. Afghanistan's a great example of that, of course. Vietnam, Iraq, Libya. I think Ukraine will ultimately be abandoned, sadly. Again, unless it just becomes part of the Russia again, part of some, kind of modified Soviet Union or something. But the West will not. They will give up on Ukraine at some point.
And how do you see this ICC, International Criminal Court, and how they're behaving, Putin, and how do you see their act?
I think the ICC has no credibility, as far as I can tell. It's been used to mostly go after African leaders, by the way, as we know, first of all. It never goes after Western leaders. And the one time it suggested it was going to go after, or at least investigate Americans for war crimes in Afghanistan, Trump responded by sanctioning some of the ICC justices and denying them visas to come to the U.S. And then, of course, the ICC backed off. So the ICC is a quintessential case of selective justice. And selective justice is not justice at all. I think the ICC is a joke, honestly, at this point, and really does not deserve to be taken seriously.
Just thinking about the US foreign policy, do you think we have two candidates right now, Donald Trump and RFK Jr.? Both of them are against this war in Ukraine, and they want to end this war as soon as possible. Let's talk about Trump first. Trump has tremendous chance in Republican Party. And do you think that the establishment gonna let him to run for presidential election?
Well, we see that they're really trying not to let him run, or if he does run, he's going to be crippled by multiple prosecutions against him and civil actions, which, will make it hard for him to run his campaign and to win. I do think he probably, if putting those things aside, he'd probably win. But now, it's going to be a challenge for him to run because of all those cases against him. So he still has a pretty good chance, but I think it's very difficult. And I do think that the powers that be will do all they can to prevent him from running for office.
And how about RFK Jr.? He's pretending to run in Democratic Party, but this party is the party of bluff. It seems that they don't want him inside the party. How do you see this?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I think, he's an interesting candidate. Actually, I just wrote a piece today endorsing him for the Substack, the Kennedy Beacon Substack. So I support RFK Jr. Yeah, he's got a tough row to hoe. I mean, his favorability numbers are higher than any other presidential candidate. So he's got that going for him. But interestingly enough, more Republicans would vote for him than Democrats, who seem very wedded to Biden. He will have a big struggle in the Democratic Party, and the Democratic leadership will do everything they can to derail his campaign, to undermine him, undermine his character. So he has huge obstacles in his path. With all that said, I mean, Biden, his favorability is very low. He seems ill. He's not going to get better. He's going to get worse as time goes on. So I don't know. Kennedy has an interesting chance. I think he's an interesting candidate. And the Democratic, nomination process is interesting. If Kennedy could come strong out of the gate and win the Iowa caucus, which is an interesting electoral process, which he could win, because I'm sure he's going to have a strong base of support. If he could win New Hampshire, things could change very quickly for him. So we'll see. Anytime an upstart challenges an incumbent like Biden, he's got a difficult row to hoe. Like Ted Kennedy did running against Carter, by the way, in 1980. But I do think, I think he's got a chance anyway.
We know that the cabinet plays a big role in any administration. These people that are working with him, we know that Trump was surrendered by neocons like Mark Pompeo. We have we had John Bolton. Whenever he was talking about why we cannot be friends with Russia, we cannot getting along with Russia, these people were against him. Do you think that if RFK Jr. makes it to the office, he's gonna be able to select people who are in line with his policy?
Well, that's a big question, isn't it? The big question would be, could he do what he says he wants to do? I'm not sure, because of the military industrial complex, which is stronger than it's ever been. You know, some believe John F. Kennedy was killed because he was going against the military industrial complex. And the military industrial complex, you know, is far, far bigger and stronger than it was then. So I think it might be difficult. The only way you could do it is if there were enough members of the ruling class who want it to happen, who do want peace. And I don't know if that's the case. So yeah, that too would be a challenge for him, even if he wins, for sure.
And in Europe, we know that in 2022, and comparing car production in Europe has reduced from 2022 to 2023, has reduced by 36%. That's huge for the Europe's economy. Do they have any power to force the Biden administration to bring sanity to this insanity in Ukraine?
I don't think they could force him to. I do think they could have an influence on him. I do think if he had enough European countries stand against this war, could make a huge difference. I think the U.S. has always depended on Western Europe to support its foreign policy aims. And if it doesn't get that support, I think it will definitely weaken the resolve of the United States. So, and I certainly hope that happens. I hope the people of Europe push their governments to start backing out of this war. That would be huge. And of course, it's up to us as American citizens here to get our government to start backing off of this war as well.
You know, if we look at this war, we have Ukraine that is losing big, so big. After that, I would argue it would be Europe more than Russia. Europe,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
because they're losing everything. They have to buy Russian oil, Russian gas from other countries, 2, 3 times more expensive. And it seems to me that when before this war getting started, I thought that you're in Europe, people can say something to just think in a reasonable manner. But it seems to me that in Europe, nobody's in I talk with Paul Carrick Roberts about these European leaders, why they're so much in the hand of the US. He said once he had a chance to talk with some officials, US officials, how they manage that. He said that with money, we give them money to run Europe. And how do you see this? Why the European leaders are not caring about their people?
Yeah, it's a little baffling to me. You certainly don't have a Charles de Gaulle anymore in Europe who's willing to take on the United States. Some of it is Germany continues to be militarily occupied by the United States, for one. But I do think there's some more intangible things at work. Yes, money's one of them. U.S. military presence is another. But I also think, these are all countries in Western Europe that had their own empires at one point that are gone. And I think for those leaders, they still kind of hitch their wagon to the U.S. empire to feel relevant and strong, certainly that's been the UK's, um, approach to foreign affairs since World War II. And that is to basically be a junior partner of the United States. And I think a lot of Western Europe is like that as well.
In your opinion, is Europe without the United States? Is there any country around the Europe threatening the security of Europe, especially Russia? Do you see any threat from Russia toward Europe?
No, of
Why,
course not.
why they're so afraid of Russia? It seems their politicians are showing this.
Well, I don't think they're afraid of Russia really in their hearts. I think they hate Russia. I think they see Russia as a competitor. I think there's a certain racism towards the Slavic people of Russia. And this goes back a long time. You can certainly go back to the Napoleonic Wars, even before that, certainly to Operation Barbarossa, when Germany attacked the Soviet Union, and when, much of the West, at least, at best stood by and let that happen. Again, so it's not so much that they fear Russia, though there may be some sort of irrational fear of it, but I think a lot of it is a hatred and a desire to kind of keep them out of Europe, which is a sad position to take, but I do think that's their position.
If you look at the Putin attitude during the last 24 years he was in office, in power in Russia, he always wanted a good relation with Europe and United States. He always tried to get better relations, to solve the problems with Europe. And we saw that they had these pipelines from Russia to Germany. This is a two-way street. You give something, get something. I would argue that without Russian gas, nobody gonna be able to provide Europe with cheap energy. And we have the food security of Europe that is dependent on Russia. With all that said, why they're still just politicians? Because they're making decisions, and in their mindset, why they're not they didn't try. Even if you remember Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, they were able to make some they were able to build on these two agreements in 2021, December 2021. What Putin wanted to do in December, he sent two letters to Biden administration and NATO headquarters. He wanted to build on those agreements, but they refused to do that. And when are they sane? Because when I'm thinking about it, they seem to me insane, because they're losing. You like all the dimensions of this war are against them. You look at the Ukraine, look at what's happening to Ukraine. We know what happened in Iraq when the United States left Iraq. All those weapons they left in Iraq end up in the hand of those terrorists. And the same thing gonna happen in Ukraine, in Afghanistan. Look at Afghanistan. We know that we have these neo-Nazis in Ukraine. This security of Europe is dependent on these issues, these problems that are happening inside Ukraine. This Ukraine gonna be a big problem for Europe and for Russia. We cannot ignore that. If it stays, if Ukraine stays in the same situation as is right now.
Yeah, well, I think Europe will be much weaker after this, for the reasons you say. I think it'll be weaker militarily. I think it'll be weaker economically. I think that the very continuation of the EU may be threatened by all this, and certainly the continuation of NATO. Um, and I think the U.S., by the way, is very happy about all that. I think the U.S., part of the goal of all this was to undermine Europe, right? Because they see Europe as a competitor just as much as Russia is, right? They may be a friendly competitor, but they're a competitor nonetheless. And I don't think the U.S. kind of makes a distinction between those competitors. There's that famous quote from Henry Kissinger that's being repeated a lot lately, that to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. And that is true, right? And Germany especially is finding that out, that it's been sold a bill of goods here with this war, that it's now becoming deindustrialized. And again, that's to the benefit of the U.S. The U.S. will try to make up for that industrial capacity. The U.S. will now sell its own natural gas to Europe. So this will benefit at least some in the U.S., in the ruling class, not the regular people in the U.S., but this will damage Europe greatly. I mean, again, the irony is this war may destroy Europe more than it does Russia.
Do you think that this war in Ukraine is one of the reasons to accelerate this de-dollarization?
Well, of course. I mean, and that's what's happening. It's mostly because of the sanctions related to the war. Russia's been utterly cut off from the financial markets of the West. And so, yeah, they are looking for other ways, and not just looking, they found other ways to sell their gas and oil, to use other currencies for that, maybe to create another currency entirely. Yeah, I mean, that is going to happen. And other countries are seeing, they're trying to do the same thing for the same reasons, because a third of the world is now under U.S. sanctions. 1/3 of the world's population is under U.S. sanctions. And those sanctions only work if those countries under the sanctions, are required to trade with the West and trade with the U.S. dollar. If they're able to get, outside of that, then those sanctions can't hurt them. And I think that's the goal of these countries, is to find a way out of the Western financial system and to find their way, out of the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency.
We have another front in Taiwan between the United States, between the US and China. In your opinion, can Taiwan be a new Ukraine for China or not? How do you see this?
Well, that's what the U.S. wants. I mean, clearly the U.S. wants to do that. Clearly the U.S. wants to weaken China in the way it wants to weaken Russia. Will it be able to do it in Taiwan as the U.S. is doing in Ukraine? I think probably not as successfully. I think China is well prepared for that eventuality. I don't think so, but I think what would ultimately happen if the U.S. tried to do that again is that Taiwan will probably be destroyed in the process. I mean, again, that's who's going to suffer are the countries that the U.S. uses as to fight their proxy wars, right? And I think Taiwan realizes that. I think Taiwan also, would be reluctant to go down that path after seeing what's happened to Ukraine. I mean, they would be foolish to do that.
For having this war in Ukraine, the US needed an administration in Ukraine that is totally in line with the rhetoric. Something like neo-Nazis now in Ukraine is the face. The facade is a Jew president, but behind the scene is all neo-Nazis that are fighting Russians. And do you think that US can get something like these neo-Nazis in Ukraine in Taiwan?
Well, that's what they would want. But again, yeah, I think that's going to be a lot more difficult. It's going to be a lot more difficult. The U.S. has been very involved in Ukraine for decades in building up these ultra-right groups to go after Russia. I don't think it's had the same ability to do that in Taiwan. And we saw in recent elections there, in the parliamentary elections, that actually the Kuomintang did very well. And while the Kuomintang historically has been obviously very adversarial towards China, they actually are the party now that wants to have some sort of rapprochement with China. So I don't think the U.S. is going to be able to have that type of front in Taiwan against China.
Just to wrap up this interview, the U.S. sent these cluster bombs to Ukraine when they asked Biden why you're sending these weapons to Ukraine. He said that we ran out of ammunition, and if NATO altogether cannot sustain a war of attrition as the Ukraine war, how they can fight China?
Well, that's a great question, isn't it? I think the answer is they can't, realistically. In fact, in that way, Russia has been very helpful to China, right? They've been fighting the West on their own in this. I think China realizes that. Yeah. I mean, how can the U.S. now pivot against China after, as you say, losing all of its munitions in Ukraine? I don't see how it can do it unless it's willing to use nuclear weapons, which God forbid that would happen. And of course, China has nuclear weapons too. So I don't see, I don't see now that the West has the capacity to wage a serious conflict against China. But I don't think that's going to stop the U.S. from trying, unfortunately.
Ex-Pentagon contractor to this military-industrial complex, he said that some screws, some little things that would cost few bucks, when it comes out in this military-industrial complex, it costs something like $11,000.
Right.
How, we considering this big budget for defense budget of the U.S., we see they're running out of ammunition so easily in Ukraine. How this process work in your mind? How do you see this process? Is a corrupt process? If it's like this?
Oh, it's incredibly corrupt, and it's been corrupt for years and years. Even when I was a kid, they talked about like toilets being sold to the Defense Department for thousands of dollars, right? This is unsustainable. This cannot go on indefinitely. I think the U.S. is going to come in for a very rude awakening. I think its empire is slowly collapsing, and you're seeing the last gasps of it. Though sadly, a wounded animal in its last gasps can be very dangerous, and I think the U.S. is, but I don't think it can sustain this sort of thing forever.
Thank you so much, Dan, for being with us today. It was a great time talking with you, discussing these issues, these problems in Ukraine. And it was so nice to meet you for the first time.
You too. You're a great interviewer. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.